when I first found the Revolutionary Worker newspaper, there's a lot of things that drew me to it, but also the internationalism, like you just mentioned. And at the time, we had the Rim, and I used to look forward to these things coming out of Iran and Turkey and different parts of the world, to see what the analysis was and how, as a movement internationally, where we were at. And of course, the people who came up in the 1930s or the 1960s, they had the example of the Soviet Union, a living example, to look at, to draw inspiration from. A lot of people even got to visit and see it. My generation and later generations, we don't have that living example. I feel we have a special obligation being in the belly of the beast. I think what you just said covered a lot of my question of like the effect of making a revolution here in the belly of the beast and what that would mean to the people of the world and how it would free up so many oppressed people around the world. But I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit on the current international situation where, you look at what's being stepped up in Israel, Erdogan in Turkey, and Orban in Hungary, and in Poland, and fascist rising in Austria, obviously in the United States, the UK, and France. A lot of people are likening this historically to the 1930s. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit on that, like you just did, but maybe more in terms of where are we at internationally. I feel like sometimes when I feel defeatist, I feel almost like just like we're screwed. Like these fascists are just like on a rampage all over the world, and we're not as organized as them, obviously. I feel like we're on our heels a bit, and I'm just wondering if you could give us some of your observations on like what's happening right now with this international struggle. And then the other question was, if you related to the culture, if you could bring back 3 artists that have passed away, like in the soundtrack we were listening to that we put together, there was Nina Simone was on there. You mentioned Phil Oakes, or it could be a visual artist, but there's also a track, we didn't play it, but from Richard Pryor, like he's somebody I'd like to bring back. But if there was 3 people you could bring back as a cultural weapon to take on this fascist regime, who would they be?
Well, this is unkind, but one of the people I'd like to bring back is Bob Dylan. But anyway. Well, I'll come. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist that, but I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that part of that question. But well, I thought you did a good job of presenting the bleak picture in the world. No, I mean the situation in the world is terrible. Okay, let's just be honest. I mean there are a lot of potential things that are, the potential positive things that do exist in the real world, so to speak. But the situation now is very bad. It's an expression of these oppressive societies, all the ones you mentioned, obviously including the U.S., feeling strains, experiencing strains and certain crises, and to go back to the Laura Ingrams and the Tucker Carlsons and the rest of them on the fascists on Fox, there is a real sense in which the world, the world and the countries, as these people have known them, are, being, objectively transformed into a significant degree, torn apart in ways that are, that have brought forward, these fascist forces. I talked to, at the beginning in part 1 about all, these 5 stops and for example, the close interconnection between what's happening with the environment and, the immigrant crisis, which is greater than what's caused by, the environmental crisis. But, it's a massive phenomenon. People on the move, in huge numbers. 65 million people. There's a tremendous number of people to be immigrants and refugees without a home, basically. And, you know, it is, in certain ways, you know, overwhelming or at least challenging what has been the existing bourgeois and oppressive societies as they've existed up to now in these countries. You know, all that is being greatly played on and greatly exaggerated by these fascist forces. But there's some reality to it. My feeling is, and my answer to all these people who complain about all the immigrants coming, across the border, many of them illegally, like, say, into the U.S. Well, okay, then. Give up everything that every parasitic benefit that you get from everything that's caused these immigrants to do this in the first place. And then after you've done that, then come back and see if you want to complain about the immigrants. Because this you can't have it both ways. They want to have it both ways, but you can't. You want to have all the plunder and all the destruction and all the disruption and all the upheaval that your system causes and all the exploitation, including of little children all around the world, which wreaks havoc in these countries, and then you want to complain when the people come here. No, you cannot have it both ways, motherfucker. I mean, look at the Congo. Many people don't know much about what's happening in the Congo, but they should. In the past couple of decades in the Congo, I think more than 5 million people have died in these internecine, conflicts within the Congo. And you could sit there and say, oh, another shithole country. Look what the people are doing to each other. But just as what's happening in the inner cities among the black and brown people and the youth in particular here, on a much more massive scale, what's happening in a place like the Congo is directly attributable to what the imperialist system has done there over more than 100 years. I mean, I'll get back to more directly to what you were raising, but this is part of the world picture, too, that's very important. I mean, do you know, for example, how many people know? I sometimes like to pose these questions. You go on a college campus, and you ask people who are graduate students and professors, for example, what percentage of people would know the answer to this question? Under the rule of Leopold, King Leopold of Belgium, who ran the Congo at the end of the 19th century and into the next, as a personal preserve, out of the 20 million people or so who lived in the Congo during those times, what percentage were killed under the rule of Leopold? Somewhere between 7 and 10 of the 20 million, almost a half of the population. Almost nobody knows about this. Think about that. They were put to work under the most horrific conditions, mining rubber and other things, and if they didn't meet the quotas or in some other way they were considered a problem, they had their hands cut off if they weren't killed. This is what, the great enlightened Western imperialism was doing in this one country. And then, finally, after World War II, when there was an independence struggle in the Congo, and you got Patrice Lumumba came forward as a popular nationalist leader and became the leader of the Congo, what happened? The U.S. imperialists moved to get rid of Lumumba. The CIA and the rest of them worked to get him captured by, opposing forces that were their puppets, basically, and he was assassinated. And what came out of all that? Mobutu, who was kept in power by the U.S. for 4 decades, plundering the country and as a puppet of the U.S. for 4 decades, and subjecting the massive people there to terrible conditions. And this is why the Congo is such a mess now. And millions more people are dying. So don't fucking complain to me about immigrants coming across the border illegally, okay? Just shut the fuck up about immigrants coming across the border illegally. Look what you have done to the people in the world. And you have the nerve to complain about people coming here trying to get a job so they can feed their family. and calling them rapists and murderers and so on. But, you know, there are a lot of strains, objectively, on all these countries that you mentioned. You know, isn't it wonderful? Look, the Soviet Union was no good for decades. It was a capitalist. In fact, even when it was socialist in name, and it was social imperialist from the mid-50s on. In other words, socialist in name, but imperialist in reality. But isn't it wonderful that finally, you know, all these Eastern European countries have been freed from the domination of the Soviet Union? Aren't wonderful things happening under the rule of these bourgeoisies in all these countries like Hungary and these other places, or Poland, and all, you know, fascists rising to power, essentially. You know, and this is what's happening in response to these great changes that are taking place in the world, including the immigrant crisis, is contributing to this. It's a fascist response to the immigrant crisis, as well as other factors. You know, a revolutionary response would be to absorb massive people coming and make them become part of the positive force transforming the society. But the imperialists can't do that, and the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, and the capitalist system can't do that. So they both exploit them, you know, or super exploit them in intense exploitation, and, you know, particularly the fascist forces within the ruling circles seize on this to build up a whole fascist backlash against these immigrants who were there because of the havoc that's been wreaked on their country, on their own countries, fundamentally because of the workings of imperialism in terms of the effect on the environment, as well as the wars and the general disruption. I mean, you know, I cited the example of NAFTA and what happened there, but you could go, you know, many countries, you know, and back in 2003, I cited the example of, you know, in a talk, you know, revolution talk back then, I cited the example of Jamaica and how many farmers there were ruined by the subsidizing of milk from the U.S., which, you know, and the same thing happened in Haiti. You can go on revcom.us and read about Haiti and how the agricultural economy of the peasants in Haiti was ruined by the penetration and dominance of the U.S. and the particular policies that were created there. You know, so again and again and again, this is, you know, what's causing, you know, both this tremendous upheaval and chaos in the world and in countries throughout the world, and it's also, you know, what is giving rise, or a big factor giving rise to these fascist movements that you're talking about. You know, look, the same thing with Israel. Israel is running into an existential crisis, or can see one down the road, not because Iran might get one nuclear weapon when Israel has hundreds, or at least more than 100, and has made clear it'll use them if it sees any threat to its existence. But what's more of an existential crisis is the Palestinian people, because they have no just solution for that. And because, you know, the conditions they put the Palestinian people in, the Palestinian population in the area is growing much faster than the Jewish population. And so, you know, this whole thing that they set up of, you know, Israel is a democratic Jewish state, those things are coming acutely into contradiction, because the more that the Palestinian population grows, not only within Israel itself, but also in the surrounding occupied territories, the more the democratic part comes under threat, because you could envision a situation if they, for example, were to absorb all these occupied territories and make them part of Israel, the Jewish population could get to a situation where it would be outnumbered by the Palestinian population, and they're not going to allow the democratic process to take place under those conditions, because it would be the end of a Jewish state, you know, a Zionist state, which is, you know, is a form of racism and apartheid as practiced there. And, you know, really the answer there is to get rid of the Zionist system in Israel, not the Jews. You know, there is no question that what has happened to Jewish people throughout history, culminating in a definite phase, in the Holocaust, where yes, millions and millions and millions were slaughtered in the most horrific way and in an almost industrial way. There is no question that that is one of the greatest crimes in the history of humanity. But as I said a couple of years ago in a dialogue I did with Cornel West, there are two responses to that among the Jewish people and more generally. One is never again, meaning never again can this happen not only to us but to any people anywhere. And the other one is, because of that whole history, anything we do to anybody else is justified, including our horrific treatment of the Palestinians. And it's the former that needs to win out over the latter, but it's the latter, the anything is justified, that's dominant now and completely in Israel. And, you know, there is neither a justification nor ultimately a viability to having a Zionist state there. What you need to have is a state that's a secular state, that's a non-religious state, a state that doesn't favor one people over another. I mean, there used to be a joke. I don't know the degree to which it's still applicable, because there's been a real growth of religious fundamentalism in Israel in recent decades. But there used to be this joke, which had real meaning, that most people in Israel, most Jews in Israel, don't believe in God, but they do know that He promised him the state of Israel. And, you know, that used to be a contradiction. Now there's a lot more religious fundamentalism among the Jewish population in Israel. But the answer is to get rid of a religious state, a state based on favoring one people. That can't happen under the present, you know, with the present forces that exist. It would be a disaster and a debacle. What you need is the emergence of revolutionary forces basing themselves on emancipating people from all forms of oppression and eliminating all forms of inequality among peoples, and creating a state there that would be for the benefit of the great majority of people, both Jewish and Palestinian. And right now that seems like a pipe dream, but it's the only just and viable resolution of the acute contradictions there. And, you know, so this is the picture in the world. Then you mentioned the RIM, which was an organization, the Revolutionary Internationalist Movement, that was forged in the 1980s out of forces who had come forward as Maoist forces, Maoist communist forces, out of the upsurge of the 1960s and into the early 1970s. And from the beginning, the RIM no longer exists, and the reason for that is from the beginning there were a lot of sharp contradictions among those different forces. Among the majority of them, as it turned out, although this wasn't so clear at the beginning and things went through a process, among the majority of them, there was their interpretation of Maoism was a combination of nationalism and communism, or nationalism presenting itself as communism. So, you know, they took a very secondary tendency in Mao, you know, who was overwhelmingly not just a communist in general, but also an internationalist, overwhelmingly, a very secondary tendency toward proceeding from the nation outward, a certain secondary nationalist tendency. They took that and raised it to a principle, and basically said that, you know, that rather than an internationalist approach of recognizing that there's a whole world system here that's operating, and that's fundamentally what's fundamentally determining what's happening in all these different countries. Instead of that, they basically said each country should proceed on the basis of its own internal dynamics, and internationalism basically, it was almost like the communist version of intersectionality or something. You know, like each country should proceed on its own interests, and on that basis should find its unity with other countries, even while we are calling ourselves communists. And there was a tremendous amount of struggle over that, but you know, that unfortunately got resolved in a negative direction. There's a lot more that went into it I don't have time to get into now, but that was a lot of what led to the dissolution of the RIM, along with the nationalism, there's also tendencies toward, you know, what we might call reification of the oppressed. In other words, the idea, which is also, by the way, a form of communist identity politics, that each rather that the, oppressed masses sort of have in them as an inherent quality a deeper ability to grasp the truth and to know where their own interests lie. And that runs directly counter to the understanding that, that question is something that has to be approached and determined scientifically. I can't resist, I have to say, that this whole identity politics thing, and it's even worse when it's applied by communists in essence, but the idea that each identity knows best, like where its oppression comes from and what's the answer to it, leads often before very long into some very serious problems. Because once you depart from the idea that there's objective reality and that you have to scientifically analyze that objective reality, then you can have people making up all kinds of things, and then they run into conflict with each other. It's one thing to recognize that if people who suffer a particular form of oppression know better than anyone else what that oppression feels like. There's some real truth to that, but that's not the same thing as understanding where that oppression comes from and what's the means for putting it into it. That's something different that has to be determined scientifically. And, I'm not about to follow Barack Obama, Clarence Thomas, or Colin Powell, who's a massive war criminal. Don't tell me that they know better what is the answer to the oppression of black people, for example, rather than this is something that has to be scientifically determined. They don't even have an interest in putting an end to that oppression because they are highly ranked functionaries of the system that embodies and enforces that oppression. And let me give you an historical example. Look at the Civil War. After the Civil War, there was a whole contingent of black people who became known as the Buffalo Soldiers because they joined with the cavalry, the military going west, to wage war against the Native Americans and steal their land and drive them into concentration camps called reservations. And they did that because that was their spontaneous thinking about how their own interests could be advanced. And on the other hand, during the Civil War, you had various Native American peoples, some of whom sided with the North, and some of whom sided with the Confederacy, all based on how they perceived the narrow interests of their people in relation to that. Here you see all these people pitted against each other. There was a movie back in the 70s with Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier, I'm sorry, I'm getting tired. There was a movie called Buck and the Preacher. And in this movie, it's an overall positive movie. And, the preacher is Harry Belafonte, he's a hustler. And Buck is someone who was a scout for the army. And then this is after the Civil War, and he's leading some black people not to go fight the Native Americans, but out to the west to try to get away from the whole, situation in the South after the Civil War and to establish a community for themselves further west. And there's a really important scene in there where they're trying to pass through the territory of one of the Indian peoples, Native American peoples, and all of a sudden a whole phalanx of these armed Native Americans appears, and Buck, played by Sidney Poitier, goes up to the war chief of the Native Americans and is trying to negotiate a passage through. And this guy says to him, well, now you want our help. But not long ago, I'm paraphrasing, I may not have it exactly right, but this is the essence of it. But not long ago, you were working with the cavalry and fighting against us. And it's a very moving part of the movie, where the Sidney Poitier character is coming to terms with this. And my point is that you have all these different oppressed peoples who, if they proceed narrowly out of their own perceived immediate interests, will end up either spontaneously or by the manipulation of the real powers of the ruling class, will end up being turned against each other time and again. And haven't we seen that over and over and over again? It's only on the basis of a scientific approach to what are the fundamental dynamics working here? What are the fundamental ways in which all oppression and exploitation can be abolished? It's only on that basis that you can forge not just a temporary and partial unity, but a long-lasting and fundamental unity that will actually bring people together on the basis of fighting for their deepest interests. Yeah. And this is a lesson paid for with a lot of bitter experience and a lot of bloodshed in the wrong ways. And look, let's be clear. It's not the Native Americans or the African Americans who were the real villains in the movie or in real life. We should be clear on who that is and what that is. It's this ruling class and this system. But the point is, how do you get out from underneath all this? What is the way forward for all the oppressed and exploited? That's the question. So, to go back to what you said, there's a very negative picture, and right now, the communist forces in the world are in disarray. There are some, such as the comrades in Iran, who are gravitating to and the new communism, and there are some others in Mexico and some other places, and there are a lot of forces out there who are fighting against it because it's going up against wrong thinking that they want to hang on to from the past. Look, like any process that's a scientific process of struggle, it's a matter of continually learning. It's a matter that reality keeps changing and that you keep learning more, and what was the most advanced thing in the past can be turned into its opposite and work against what you need if you persist in the secondary aspects of it that were not correct in the face of new challenges and changing conditions. And this is something that's very important to understand. We have to keep on learning and digging deeper. We used to think that the way that you were going to seize power in this country, and if you go back even just to 2003 in the talk I gave, Revolution, Why It's Necessary, Why It's Possible, and What It's All About, I put forward what was our understanding then, that this was going to be achieved when a revolutionary crisis occurred and there would be mass insurrections all over the country simultaneously. And then you would quickly establish a new revolutionary regime and fight a civil war to finish off the old ruling class. And for some of the reasons that I spoke to today in my talk, we came to understand that that was not a way that you were going to be able to carry out the revolutionary process to overthrow the system and bring into being a new system, because, among other things, as I spoke to, it would be very difficult to imagine that you could have those simultaneous insurrections in that kind of way and actually win the initial phase in that kind of way. And secondarily, and at least as importantly, even if you could do that, if you tried to establish a new revolutionary state very quickly like that, you'd be highly vulnerable to the remaining still, almost certainly still powerful forces of the old ruling class, and you would not be able to mount the kind of opposition to them that could defeat them. You'd be basically sitting ducks for them. So we went through a lot, that's what we thought was the way it would be done. We thought that for decades. That was the conventional wisdom in the communist movement that was handed down to us, if you want to put it that way. And, and then we came to grips with it. Well, is this, at a certain point, we said, well, can this really succeed? Is this really a viable way to go about this? And we had to conclude that no, it's not. And instead, we had to go about it the way that I was laying out today, and that's concentrated in how we can win and spelled out more thoroughly and on the possibility of revolution. So my point being, there's a constant process, as there is with any scientific endeavor, of continuing to learn. You have a core of knowledge, of fundamental knowledge that you're proceeding from. You don't start and go back. You don't start from zero and go back to the beginning every time something new emerges in the world, or every time you learn that something you thought was true is only partially true or not true at all. There is a core of knowledge that you're proceeding on that's been scientifically established and tested in reality repeatedly and from many angles over a period of time. But even in that core of knowledge, sometimes one or another secondary aspect of it can prove to be not true. That's true in any field: medicine, physics, biology, chemistry, any field that you think of. And it's true in the social sciences too. Things that you thought were true and were on a solid foundation proved to be not entirely true, either because conditions change and what was correct and appropriate in the old conditions no longer is, or because you weren't correct in the first place, and new knowledge new experience has led you to come to the understanding that you have to change what you understand about that and approach it differently. This is all part of the process, but if you get stuck, if you treat communism not as a living scientific process of struggle, to continually, probe reality, investigate reality by seeking to change it and learning about it, and then, further synthesizing what you learn are the larger patterns in reality and what they show you. If you don't approach it that way, but you approach it like a dogma with a set of almost religious principles that are unchanging, and then you go out into the real world, which is constantly changing, you're going to end up in a ditch at some point or other. And this is what's happened to a lot of people, and even things that were very positive at one time can be turned into their opposites if you're stubbornly clinging to things that were secondary in that positive thing, but which have been proven not to be true, and you're raising them up into a principle that's guiding everything you're doing, you're going to end up in a ditch. And so, yes, this picture is not good. One thing we can say from all that is the picture is not good right now. We have to go out and transform it radically. And yes, we have to have the chutzpah. We have to have the orientation, the conquering spirit, if you want to put it that way, to take upon ourselves the responsibility of struggling for this in the entire world. Not because we're so great and smart and everything else, or have never made any mistakes. We made plenty of them. But because it's necessary in terms of what is fundamentally needed and required to emancipate humanity. So yes, we have to take on this responsibility because it's been thrust before us and there isn't anybody else who's doing it, so we have to do it. It's the same spirit when I said I approached learning about political economy. It's hard, it's daunting, things are not favorable in the short run, but we have two things going for us. Most profoundly, reality. And second of all, a scientific approach to that reality and how to transform it to emancipate humanity. Other than that, I just say one sentence so we can get to his question. That's too hard of a question. There are too many. So why doesn't everybody make up a list, and then we'll think about how to bring forward new people to play that role.